They said Leonard Alcott had wasted the only real money he ever saved on a rotting shack full of dead wooden birds. And for 17 years, his widow believed them. Vivian Alcott was 54 years old the morning she finally drove out to see it. She had $96.18 left in a checking account that had once held two people's wages, a 2003 station wagon with a heater that worked on its own schedule, and a folded note in her late husband's blocky handwriting that she had carried in her purse so long the creases had gone soft as worn cloth. The note said four things. Don't sell the shanty. It has to stay in the family. I'll explain someday. Promise me. For 17 years, she had kept that promise without understanding it the way you keep an old key on your ring long after you've forgotten what door it opens, because throwing it away feels like admitting something you're not ready to admit. But what nobody in Corwin County could have guessed, what nobody who passed the collapsing gray structure out on Heron's Point and called it an eyesore had ever bothered to imagine, was that behind one ordinary wall of that worthless shanty was something so carefully hidden, so quietly valuable, and so completely misjudged by everyone who had ever shaken their head at Leonard Alcott that it would not merely lift Vivian out of poverty. It would reach back across decades and prove that the quietest man she had ever loved had understood something about the world that the loud ones never would. Stay with me to the end of this story, because the morning Vivian Alcott finally walked through that shanty door and saw what her husband had spent 17 years protecting, everything she thought she knew about her own life turned out to be only half the picture. Before we go on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if a story like this one finds something real in you, take a second to subscribe, because tomorrow I have set aside something just as good. Now let me take you back to the cold March morning when Vivian Alcott ran out of every other option she had. The Tidewater Rest Motel sat on the old county road that the new bypass had quietly strangled over the course of a decade. Everyone who worked there had known it was dying the way you know an old dog is dying slowly at first, and then with a terrible speed that makes you feel foolish for not having prepared yourself. The owner, a tired man named Dale who had inherited the place from his father and never wanted it, taped the closure notice to the time clock on a Friday morning and stood in the parking lot that afternoon to hand out final checks and apologize to each woman individually, which was more than most men in his position would have done. Vivian had cleaned 11 rooms a day for 9 years at the Tidewater Rest. She knew the particular smell of industrial bleach mixed with the cheap floral spray the management bought by the case. She knew the precise angle at which to strip a fitted sheet from a corner mattress so it came off clean in one motion without straining your lower back. She knew how to make a room look cared for even when the carpet was 15 years past replacing and the grout had given up any pretense of being white. That was a skill. Nobody had ever called it one, but it was. Her final check covered the last payment on the station wagon and left her with the $96. The room she rented above a shuttered hardware store in the town of Wexford had come with a cleaning arrangement she had made with the building's owner, a decent man named Paul who let her stay cheap in exchange for keeping the stairwell clean and the pipes from freezing in winter. With the motel gone, that arrangement was gone too. Paul gave her to the end of the month. He was sorry about it. People were always sorry about it. Vivian sat in the station wagon in the empty motel parking lot for a long time after the other women had driven away. The marsh wind came in off the flat fields to the east and rocked the car gently on its springs, and she watched it move through the brown winter cordgrass at the edge of the lot, bending everything one way as if the whole landscape were kneeling before something she couldn't see. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had done most of her crying a long time ago in a hospital corridor that smelled of burned coffee and antiseptic floor wax, holding a younger version of the same purse she still carried. Listening to a doctor explain in the careful, measured language of a man who delivers this kind of news more often than anyone should have, to that her husband Leonard had not survived the second heart attack the way he had survived the first. Leonard had been 46. They had been married for 14 years. They had no children, not because they hadn't wanted them, but because the children never came. And after a while, the empty room at the end of the hall became something they walked past without speaking about a shared grief so familiar it had become part of the architecture of their life together. When Leonard died, that emptiness simply expanded to fill every room. Then the house itself went the way houses go when one income becomes none and the bank runs out of patience. And Vivian had spent 17 years moving through smaller and smaller spaces, getting skilled at making each one look cared for. In all those years, she had never once driven out to Heron's Point. She knew exactly where the property was. Everyone in Corwin County knew the old Graves place, the gray gunning shanty at the end of the Marsh Causeway, where the Wadham Creek widened into the bay. She knew Leonard had bought it 11 years into their marriage for $300 at a county tax sale, a sum that at the time had felt to her like throwing money into the tide. She remembered the argument, one of the only real ones they ever had. A quiet argument, conducted in the low voices of people who have thin walls and considerate habits, in which she had asked him what a boat mechanic wanted with a falling down duck blind 9 miles from anywhere. He had not been able to answer her, not in words she could use. He had said only that it mattered that someday he would explain that she should trust him, and because she had loved him, she had let it go. He never did explain. The someday ran out in a hospital corridor, and the shanty passed to her along with his tools and his good winter coat, and the note she found later tucked into the band of his fishing hat, written on the back of a fuel receipt in his blocky, careful hand. Don't sell the shanty, it has to stay in the family. I'll explain someday. Promise me. For 17 years, she had paid the modest annual property taxes out of money she did not have. 3 figures she could ill afford charged to a credit card she paid down slowly every month, because a promise was a promise, even when you had stopped understanding the reason for it. Leonard's brother Prescott had called it sentiment. His sister Blythe had called it foolishness. Vivian had called it nothing at all, because she had learned that some things only survive if you don't look at them too directly. But a woman with $96 and no roof at the end of the month cannot afford to leave anything unexamined anymore. She drove out on a Tuesday. The county road gave way to a state road. The state road gave way to a stretch of crumbling asphalt that was mostly the memory of pavement. And that road gave way at last to a long causeway of crushed oyster shell that ran out across the marsh toward the point, the tires of the station wagon crunching and popping over the shell in a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial, as if the road itself were announcing her arrival to something that had been waiting. On either side of the causeway, the marsh stretched flat and enormous, threaded with silver channels of tidal water, and the smell came in through the gap at the top of the passenger window, the one that had never quite sealed right. It was a smell Vivian hadn't known she remembered. Low and rich and ancient salt and mud and cold mineral bay water and the faint sweetness of cordgrass drying in the late winter sun. It was the smell of every childhood she'd had in this county. It was the smell of a place that did not care whether a person succeeded or failed, and there was something in that indifference that felt just then almost like relief. Then the shanty came into view at the end of the point and she stopped the car. She had expected something bad. The photographs in the county assessor's file, which she had finally requested after Dale handed her the last check, had prepared her for a structure in poor condition. They had not prepared her for this. The shanty was a long, low building of weathered cypress board, 2 rooms by the look of it, sitting on a raised foundation of hand-laid stone at the edge of the marsh. The standing seam tin roof had failed at one corner, peeled back and curled like the lid of a can opened badly. The whole structure had settled toward the waterside, developing a lean that suggested not imminent collapse, but a kind of long, patient resignation. The windows on the water-facing wall were gone, replaced by nothing, just dark, open sockets that let the weather in and out freely. A collapsed shed sagged off the back of the building, its skeleton of gray timber showing through what remained of the siding like ribs through old skin. The wooden walkway to the dock had surrendered to the marsh entirely. Only the pilings remained leaning at various angles out into the gut of tidal water, the dock they had once supported long since rotted away. A condemnation notice from the county was tacked beside the door, its paper faded nearly white by sun and salt air, the county seal still just visible. The tax assessor's most recent valuation, $0 for the structure. Not low. 0. The land beneath it, 3.5 acres of marsh that flooded twice daily with the tide, had been valued at a sum that would not have covered 2 months of Vivian's motel rent. She sat in the car and looked at the thing her husband had made her promise to keep for 17 years. And for the first time since she had found his note, she let herself feel the full weight of how senseless it seemed. A man who fixed boat engines for a living, who bought secondhand tools and drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, who had never once complained about the smallness of their life together, had taken $300 they could not spare and purchased a worthless building on a marsh point that was slowly losing its argument with the tide. And then he had died before he could explain why. And she had spent 17 years carrying the weight of a promise she couldn't understand, paying taxes on a property that had never given her anything but a line on a bill. She got out of the car. The wind found her immediately, came straight off the bay, and went through her coat in a way that suggested the coat had been adequate for other winters, but had reached its limit. She walked toward the shanty with her arms folded across herself and her cleaner's eye already moving over the building, out of long habit reading the damage, the way she had always read the damage in rooms other people had left behind. The foundation was the first surprise. She had expected the whole structure to be rotten through, to press her thumbnail into a sill and have it sink like the wood was wet cardboard. Instead, the building sat on low, solid cypress sills that had been set into a base of mortared stone, and when she crouched and pressed her nail into the wood, it was hard as iron. Cypress did not rot. The old watermen who had built in this county had known that, had built their most important things from it because they understood the relationship between the marsh and time in a way that people who came later never quite recovered. Whoever had built this shanty had built it to stand. The roof had failed, the siding had checked and split, the walkway had gone back to the marsh. But the bones of the building were holding, and they would keep holding for another 100 years if someone gave them half a reason to. The door was secured with a hasp and a padlock that had long since fused into a single mass of orange rust. The key Leonard had left her, the old iron key she had carried in the bottom of her purse all these years, would not have turned it now. She did not need it to. She found a length of galvanized pipe in the rubble of the collapsed shed and worked it through the hasp's loop and pulled with both hands, and the wood around the screws, soft with years of moisture, gave way with a low tearing sound, and the door swung inward into the dark. The smell that came out of the shanty was not the smell of the marsh. It was older and drier and entirely its own. Linseed oil, cedar shavings turned to a fine pale dust, old paint gone chalky with age, the resinous ghost of some finish she couldn't name. And underneath all of it, something faint and almost sweet, the smell of a place that has been closed up and carefully sealed for a very long time, a place that has been keeping something. Vivian stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust, and slowly as the gray March light filtered in around her, the inside of her husband's inexplicable purchase took shape. It was a workshop. She had told herself not to expect much. A dirt floor, an empty shell, the remains of whatever purpose the building had originally served. Instead, she was standing at the threshold of a craftsman's shop that appeared to have been sealed and left precisely as it was frozen at the moment of its last use, as completely as if the man who had worked here had stepped outside for an hour and simply not come back. A long workbench ran the full length of the inland wall, its surface worn into shallow valleys by decades of use, dark with oil and age, and the memory of 10,000 hours of careful work. Above the bench, tools hung on a board, each in its traced outline, the way a meticulous man hangs his tools so he can see at a glance what is missing and what is in its place. Drawn knives with their curved blades, spoke shaves and gouges and rasps of various sizes, their wooden handles worn smooth and dark, their steel edges spotted now with rust, but their order undisturbed. In the corner, a treadle-powered grinding wheel sat with a patience that seemed almost animate. And on every surface on the shelves that climbed both side walls, on the bench itself, on the swept plank floor in rows that had gathered a film of gray dust, there were birds. Wooden birds, dozens of them, scores of them. Ducks mostly in every state of completion, from rough-cut blocks that suggested a body only in the most general terms to finished pieces with painted surfaces, their colors faded and cracked, but the patterns still readable beneath the age. The dark cap of a bufflehead, the rust-colored head of a redhead drake, the clean black and white geometry of a canvas back, rendered in paint that had dimmed to a soft, chalky version of itself, but had not lost the accuracy of its observation. Vivian moved into the room slowly, her footsteps quiet on the plank floor. She picked up the nearest finished bird, a mallard hen in faded brown and buff, and turned it in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, and lighter than she expected, dense in the palm, with a bottom that had been carefully hollowed and fitted with a thin board so the whole piece would ride low and level in the water. She had seen decoys before. Everyone who had grown up in this part of Maryland had. Old watermen still kept their working rigs in the backs of trucks, in the corners of sheds. Rough carved blocks their grandfathers had made, and their fathers had lost in the marsh and replaced without much ceremony. Tools of the trade, nothing more. But these were not the rough working blocks she half remembered from the sheds of old men. Whoever had made these had possessed a skill that went far beyond utility. The sweep of a carved wing feather, the precise tilt of a head that captured in a block of wood the exact attitude of a living duck in a moment of alert calm. The glass eyes, dark amber, set at an angle that gave each bird an expression she could only describe as present. As if the thing were genuinely looking at something just beyond her shoulder. She set the bird down carefully on the bench. Then she moved along the shelves, lifting and turning each piece, and as she did, the workshop grew larger in her understanding. This was not a duck blind. This was not a hunting camp. This was the life's work of someone who had spent years learning to make something functional, beautiful, and then kept that work sealed behind a locked door and a rusted hasp where no one could see it. She did not yet understand what she was holding. She only understood that her husband had not bought a shack. He had bought this. And then she found the thermos. It was at the end of the workbench, a dented steel thermos she half recognized from the rack above the sink in their kitchen, the one Leonard took on the boat when he worked winter jobs out on the bay. It sat beside a folding canvas chair, the kind that holds the shape of the person who uses it, and the shape it held was the shape of a man she knew. Beside the chair, coiled on a nail, a length of newer line, not antique, not part of whatever the workshop had originally been. Purchased recently. Recently enough. And on the floor beneath the bench, in his blocky handwriting on the back of an old receipt, a list. Lumber dimensions. Roofing tin. Screws and caulk, and a particular weight of waterproof membrane. The materials of a repair he had been planning and had never begun. He had come out here. The knowledge went through her like the cold from the bay, complete and sudden. In the years of their marriage, when she had thought him simply a quiet man who worked too much and found words difficult, he had been driving 9 miles out to the end of this causeway alone, sitting in this canvas chair in this sealed workshop full of birds. She knew nothing about keeping a secret he had never found the way to share. She had grieved a husband she thought she had known completely. She understood now, standing in the cold half-light of his hidden room, that she had only ever known the half of him that could be expressed in conversation and daily life. The better half had been out here the whole time, sitting in a canvas chair with a thermos of coffee, dreaming a restoration he never quite started, keeping faith with something she hadn't known existed. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went back to the car for her cleaning supplies, because cleaning was the only way she knew to begin to understand a place. She found him on the second morning. She had spent the first day clearing the worst of the debris from the interior, sweeping decades of mouse litter and dead leaves out the door, covering the open windows with plastic sheeting she had bought in town, and sealing the worst of the drafts with the roll of weather stripping in her kit. It was not a real repair. It was the beginning of a conversation with the building, the first step in a negotiation that would take time. She slept that first night in her bedroll on the workshop floor, warm enough with the drafts controlled, listening to the tide moving in the marsh channels all around the point, that vast, soft, seething sound that she had not heard since childhood and had not known she missed. On the second morning, she woke before the light and lay still listening. Real ducks were calling somewhere out on the water. She thought about that for a while, about the fact that live ducks were calling on the same water where someone had once set carved wooden ones to draw them in, and about the idea that the purpose of a false thing could be to bring the real ones home. She was carrying the slop bucket out to the marsh edge in the gray half-light when she saw the shape in what remained of the collapsed shed. A long shape under a square of blue tarp drawn up against the far wall where the roof had held longest and the floor was driest. And when her boot scraped the oyster shell that bordered the shed, the shape came awake fast and silent, the way something comes awake that has learned the hard lesson of what waking to strangers can mean. He was a young man 18 or close to it with a watch cap pulled down to his eyebrows, and the particular thinness of someone who has not been eating regularly for longer than a few weeks. He had a canvas bag that held she would come to know everything he owned in the world. He looked at her the way a cornered thing looks, not with aggression, but with the practiced stillness of someone who has already calculated the exits. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself in the offices of landlords and bank managers and county assistance workers, the look of a person who has been told to leave more times than they can count and has learned to read the signs in advance so the blow lands a little softer. She did not deliver the blow. She told him there was coffee on the camp stove inside and oatmeal enough for two, and she turned and walked back toward the shanty without waiting to see what he would do with that information, because she had learned long ago that the surest way to keep a frightened thing from bolting is to stop looking at it. He came in when the cold drove him in. He ate quickly and without looking up the way the hungry eat when they are also ashamed of being hungry. He told her his name was Cody Marsh. He said he had been sleeping in the shed for 3 weeks since before the weather turned, and he would clear out if she wanted. He said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who has made this offer before and learned not to put too much hope in the answer. Vivian told him she did not want that. She told him there was a good deal of work and not much money, but the work was real and she could use a second pair of hands. She did not ask where his people were. The absence of them was the loudest thing about him, and she knew from long experience that some questions are only a way of making someone say out loud what they already know about how alone they are. He stayed. He held the ladder while she worked. He hauled salvaged board from the ruins of the shed without being asked. He was stronger than he looked and more careful than most boys his age, the kind of careful that comes not from training but from habit, from having learned that broken things are harder to fix than whole ones. On the third afternoon, coming around the corner of the building unexpectedly, Vivian saw him sitting on an overturned crate with a piece of scrap pine in one hand and a small bone-handled pocket knife in the other, worrying the wood down to nothing in particular, with a concentration that didn't match the aimlessness of what he was making. She filed it away without a word. On the fourth day, she began to inventory the birds. Some instinct told her they mattered in a way she hadn't yet found the language for. The working decoys on the open shelves were already impressive enough to give her pause, but it was the systematic thoroughness of the workshop, the care with which every tool had been placed and every piece of work stored that made her move through it slowly and methodically, lifting each bird, wiping it clean, setting it in rows on the swept floor to see what was there. She started at the top shelf on the left side of the room and worked her way down. By the time she reached the lowest shelf on the inland wall, the one fixed directly to the cypress boarding, she had counted 43 working decoys in varying states of age and finish. She had begun to notice patterns in the work, the way the carving grew more refined as she moved from older pieces to newer ones, as if she were watching a skill mature over the course of decades. A man teaching himself something difficult and getting better at it with each year that passed. She moved her cleaning cloth along the backs of the cypress boards that formed the inland wall, working behind the lowest shelf. Her hand caught, not on a nail, not on a rough patch of wood, on a seam. She knelt and looked. The cypress boarding ran floor to ceiling all along that wall, vertical tongue and groove planks, beaded and fitted close in the manner of the best interior work of a century ago. But there was a section about 3 feet wide and centered between two shelf uprights where the boarding didn't quite match. The gaps between planks had been filled and sanded and painted to blend with the surrounding wall so carefully that you would never see the difference unless your hand happened to fall across it and feel the subtle variation in texture. Vivian pressed her palm flat against that section and pushed. The wall gave, just slightly. The faintest flex the resistance not of solid wood, but of a fitted panel set in a frame. She stood and stepped back and looked at the wall. She pressed along the edges, top and bottom and sides, feeling for the frame, and it was there hidden in the joins a door with its hinges set into the back of the frame so no hardware showed on the face. 3 feet wide running from the floor to just above the lowest shelf, fitted so tightly that no light leaked around it. Sealed, she realized, with the particular attention of someone who wanted very much to make certain it would never be found by accident. Someone had built a hidden compartment into the wall of this shanty, and someone had gone to extraordinary trouble to make certain no one would ever know it was there. Vivian stood in the cold, dim workshop with the marsh tide rising around the point outside and felt something move in her chest that she had not permitted herself to feel in a long time. Not hope exactly, because hope had cost her too much over the years, and she had learned to be careful with it. It was something more precise than hope. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of an answer to a question she had stopped letting herself ask. Why Leonard? Why this place? Why the promise? Why me? She found a thin pry bar in the rack above the bench, its handle worn smooth by the same hands that had worn smooth all the other handles in this room. She held it for a moment. Then she made herself set it down, made herself breathe. She went to the doorway and looked out. Cody was in the yard stacking salvaged board by size against the side of the building, working with that quiet efficiency she had come to recognize as his natural mode. He looked up when her shadow fell across the threshold. She told him he could take the afternoon. She told him she had something to look at inside and she needed some quiet to do it right. He nodded once and went back to the board pile, not asking, not pressing the way he never pressed about anything. She had noticed that about him. He had the courtesy of someone who understood what it cost to explain yourself, and so never asked other people to do it unnecessarily. She went back inside. She picked up the pry bar. Before she opened that wall, I need to ask one thing of you, because we are coming to the heart of the story now. If you have ever held on to something a person you loved left behind, even when the whole world told you it was foolishness, even when you yourself had started to believe them, then the next part of the story is for you. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now and tell us in the comments about a promise you kept that you didn't fully understand. We read every one. And then stay with me, because what Vivian Alcott found behind that wall is the reason we're all still here. The panel did not want to come. It had been fitted by someone who fitted things to last, and 60 years of humidity and pressure had settled it firmly into its frame. Vivian worked the bar gently into the seam at the top, easing it with the care of someone who has learned to open stuck things without breaking them, and she felt the old glue release in a long, reluctant creak that ran from the top of the panel to the bottom. She set the bar down and worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. The whole section of wall came away in her hands lighter than she expected. A single fitted door of cypress, its hinges set flush into the back, concealed so completely that she had been running her cleaning cloth across its face for 4 days without knowing it was there. Behind it was a cabinet built into the cavity between the inner and outer walls of the shanty, framed and shelved with the same patient craftsmanship as everything else in the room. The air that breathed out of it was different from the air in the rest of the workshop, drier and stiller, the sealed breath of a space that had been closed since before Vivian was born. The wood of the shelves was darker here, protected from light for decades, and there was a faint sweetness to the air that she recognized only later as the smell of old linseed oil in a perfectly enclosed space. 3 shelves, and on each shelf wrapped first in oilcloth gone stiff and amber with age, and then in a second layer of clean muslin objects she could not yet identify by touch alone. She unwrapped the first one from the top shelf. It was a duck, a canvas-back drake she would learn the name later, with a long, sloped russet head and a pale gray body and a bill that had been carved with a precision that made every other decoy in the room look like practice work. But it was not the form that stopped her. It was the surface. Whoever had painted this bird had done something to the wet paint with a fine-toothed tool or a stiff brush, dragging it through the color in thousands of tiny strokes so that what appeared from a distance to be a solid tone resolved on close examination into the suggestion of individual feathers, layer upon layer, the way a living bird's plumage actually looks when the light hits it right. The eyes were deep amber glass, set at an angle that gave the bird an expression of such composed alertness that Vivian held it at arm's length for a moment, half expecting it to move. On its bottom burned into the smooth wood a small brand, the letters S and G inside the outline of a flying bird. She set it down on the bench and unwrapped the next one, and the next, and the next. A pair of swans with their necks arched back along their bodies in the curve of rest. A flock of small shorebirds on legs thin as wire, each one slightly different from the others, each one caught in a different attitude of attention. A great blue heron, nearly 2 feet tall, its neck folded, its carved eye fixed on something only it could see. A canvasback hen with a body so perfectly balanced in the hand that Vivian turned it over and over, unable to identify what made it feel so right, until she understood that it was weight, that the hollow body and the lead keel fitted beneath the bottom board had been calibrated so exactly that the bird would have ridden level on any water without adjustment. She unwrapped them one at a time slowly and set them in a row on the bench. And as the row grew, she felt the quality of the silence in the room change, the way the quality of silence in a room changes when something extraordinary is being revealed. 31 birds in all. 31 birds wrapped and hidden and waiting in the sealed dark of a wall in a shanty her husband had bought for $300 and made her promise never to sell. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, and then in a square of old canvas and bound with a leather thong gone as hard as wire, was a book. It was a ledger, the kind a shopkeeper might once have kept accounts in, bound in stiff black board with a cloth spine, thickened by decades of handling. The leather thong had been knotted with the deliberate care of someone who wanted it to stay knotted for a very long time. Vivian untied it with cold and careful fingers. The knot gave slowly, stiffly, and the canvas fell open, and she lifted out the ledger and opened it to the first page. The ink had gone the color of weak tea. The handwriting was rough and slow, the careful printing of a self-taught man who formed each letter with intention. At the top of the page, a name and a year: Solomon Graves, 1911. And below it, centered on the page in the same labored hand, a single line that Vivian read 3 times before she turned to the next page. A decoy's only job is to bring the others home. She sat down in Leonard's canvas chair. Outside, the tide was coming in. She could hear it filling the channels of the marsh, that vast, soft seething all around the point, and over it, the distant calling of real ducks somewhere out on the bay. The camp stove ticked quietly in the corner. The 31 birds sat in their row on the workbench, watching her with their amber glass eyes. And Vivian Alcott, who had not cried since a hospital corridor 17 years ago, opened the ledger to the second page and began to read the life of a man who had been dead longer than she had been alive. She read for 2 hours without stopping. Solomon Graves had been born on Heron's Point in 1881, the son of a waterman and the grandson of one, and he had spent the first 30 years of his life doing what the men of his family had always done, which was to kill ducks by the hundreds and ship them to the hotels and restaurants of Baltimore and Philadelphia, where canvasback and redhead were served on white tablecloths to people who would never see the marsh that produced them. Market gunning, the ledger called it. Hard and brutal and freezing, lying in a wooden box sunk to the waterline in the bay, through December nights that could kill you if you weren't careful, operating the punt gun, a single-barreled cannon mounted in the bow of a low boat that could take 40 birds at one shot. He had been good at it. The early pages of the ledger were full of the tallies, the prices per bird, the accounts of particular seasons. And then the tallies began to fall. Page after page after page, the numbers declined. The great rafts of canvasback that had once seemed inexhaustible thinned year by year, and Solomon Graves, who had no formal education past the age of 9, observed this with the precise attention of a man whose life depended on understanding what the marsh was telling him. He did not need a scientist to explain what was happening. He had watched it happen under his own punt gun. When the federal law came in 1918, making market gunning illegal and ending the commercial harvest of wild waterfowl for good, the other gunners cursed it, and some of them went right on breaking it in the dark for years. Solomon Graves did not. He wrote that the law had only said in language what the empty sky had already said plainly. He hung up the big gun and turned to the one other skill his hands knew, which was making decoys. And over the following decades, he taught himself entirely from observation and practice, and the evidence of his own failures to do it better than anyone working in wood had done it on that bay before. The ledger was the record of that teaching, the kinds of wood and why, the way to hollow a body so it rode the worst water without shipping a drop, the paint mixed from white lead and linseed and earth pigments, and the comb stroke that broke a flat tone into the suggestion of 1,000 separate feathers. It was a craftsman's manual written by a man who had never read a craftsman's manual, who had only worked until he understood what he was doing and why it produced the results it produced. But the other record in the ledger was the one that made Vivian stop breathing for a moment when she first encountered it. Beginning in 1918, the same year Solomon put down the punt gun, the entries began to include names that were not his own. A waterman from Two Guts over drowned in a December squall, left 3 sons and no insurance. The eldest, 14 years old, turned up at the shanty that January because there was no food in the house. Solomon took him on, taught him to rough cut a body and then to refine it and then to finish it. The boy sold birds in the city that winter and kept his family through the worst of it. Solomon recorded the transaction in the ledger not as charity, a word he seemed to regard as an insult to the recipient, but as wages paid in advance against skills the boy was acquiring. He kept count of everyone. A boy whose father drank the family into ruin. A boy turned out of an orphan home in the city at 16 with nowhere to go, who rode the train as far as his money lasted and walked the rest of the way and slept in the shanty, and whom Solomon found in the morning and offered a knife and a block of wood instead of a warning to leave. He named them all. He noted what he had observed about each one, a thing they had done that surprised him, a quality he had noticed, as if the point of the ledger was not the birds at all, as if the birds had only ever been the occasion for something else entirely. A decoy's only job is to bring the others home. He had written it in 1911 on the first page, and he had written it again on the last page he ever filled in, a hand gone shaky with age in the spring of 1959. He died 2 years later in 1961, and the ledger passed to the next keeper of the place. Between those 2 written dates, he had spent 4 decades using wooden birds to do exactly that, setting himself out at the edge of the world like a false bird riding cold water, drawing the lost ones into a place where they could land. After Solomon's final entry in 1959, other hands had continued the book across the years that followed. The boys grown into men, each one adding his name when he became a keeper of the place, each one writing beneath his name the same lines Solomon had written on the first page. A chain of people who had learned the trade and the obligation together, who had understood that you could not take one without the other. Vivian turned through the later pages, slowly reading each name. The chain grew thinner in the later decades, the entries fewer and farther apart, as the world changed and the craft shrank to a specialty, and Heron's Point became harder to reach and easier to forget. And then near the end in handwriting, she would have known anywhere in the blocky, careful printing of a man who had written her 1,000 grocery lists, she found her husband's name, Leonard Alcott. And below it in the same hand as everyone who had come before him, a decoy's only job is to bring the others home. Vivian sat very still in the canvas chair that held the shape of him. She had grieved the Leonard she knew, the quiet man who fixed engines and drove a truck and found words difficult and loved her without saying so very often, and died before he could explain the most important thing about himself. She had spent 17 years grieving that Leonard. She had not known there was another one to grieve. She turned back through the ledger, not reading now, but scanning, looking at the names of the boys Solomon had taken in across 50 years of keeping this place. And in the entries from the early 1960s kept by whoever had taken over the book, in the years just after Solomon's death, she found an entry that made her stop. A boy named Darrow Marsh, taken in the entry, said in the summer of 1964, 16 years old, angry in the way of someone caring more than they have words for, self-sufficient in the way that conceals real hunger. The notation below his name read, "The anger in him is only grief with nowhere to go." Marsh. Vivian sat with that name for a long moment. She thought about the boy asleep in the collapsed shed 3 weeks before she arrived. The boy who had eaten her oatmeal without looking up. The boy with the pocket knife and the scrap of pine working the wood down to something she hadn't been able to identify yet. She thought about the name he had given her offered without warmth, with the economy of someone who has learned that personal information is a resource you spend carefully. Cody Marsh. She closed the ledger slowly. Outside, the light had gone to the flat gray of late afternoon, and the marsh was loud with the evening coming in off the bay. The 31 birds sat on the bench in the dimness, their amber eyes catching what light remained. Vivian sat in her dead husband's chair and looked at them and thought about the thing Solomon Graves had written on the first page of a book in 1911, and about a 16-year-old boy named Darrow Marsh, who had turned up angry and hungry at the same shanty 60 years ago, and about the 18-year-old boy outside who had turned up the same way a month ago, and had not yet been given any reason to believe that things were going to be different this time. She did not understand yet, not fully. She only felt the shape of it the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark before the light comes on. She rose from the chair and set the ledger carefully on the bench beside the 31 birds, and she went to the door. Cody was still outside in the last of the light, standing at the edge of the yard where the oyster shell gave way to the marsh grass, looking out at the water. He had his hands in his pockets and his shoulders up against the cold, watching the ducks out on the bay with an expression she couldn't read from behind. She told him to come inside when he was ready. She told him the stove was on and there was enough for supper. He turned and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he nodded. The tidal creek out beyond the pilings caught the last of the day's light and held it briefly bright, as something just discovered. And then the light went and the marsh settled into the dark. And from somewhere out on the water, the ducks kept calling, invisible now, just sound moving across the surface of the bay toward wherever the lights were. The next morning, Vivian wrapped 3 of the birds in a clean dish towel she had brought from Wexford. The canvas-back drake from the hidden cabinet, the one with the comb-painted feathers and the amber glass eyes. One of the shorebirds, a small thing barely 6 inches long, carved with a delicacy that seemed impossible for human hands working in wood. And a bufflehead drake from the open shelves, older and rougher than the cabinet birds, but still possessed of a quality she had no language for yet. She put the ledger in a Ziploc bag and set it on the passenger seat. Cody was awake when she came out to the car, sitting on an overturned crate in the yard with his coffee, watching the morning come in off the bay. She told him she had an errand in Wexford and would be back by afternoon. If he wanted to keep working on the shed lumber, that was fine. If he didn't, that was fine too. He asked what was in the towel. She told him she wasn't entirely sure yet. He nodded at that as if it were a reasonable answer, because with Cody Marsh, most honest answers were reasonable answers. And she drove back along the Oyster Shell Causeway toward the county road with the particular feeling of a woman who is carrying something important without yet knowing how important it is. The town of Wexford had one place that might know what she was holding. It was a narrow shop on the main street with a hand-lettered sign above the door that read Bayfront Antiques, and Vivian had passed it 10,000 times in the course of 9 years of driving to and from the Tidewater Rest without ever once going in. The window display was crowded and eclectic, old nautical charts and wooden floats and iron hardware, and she saw now for the first time a row of wooden decoys arranged on a shelf at the back of the window. The bell above the door announced her. The man who kept the shop was named Roscoe Fitch. He was somewhere in his mid-70s, narrow and slightly stooped, in the way of tall men who have spent a lifetime in low-ceilinged spaces, with a pair of reading glasses pushed up into white hair, and the still patient quality of a man who has spent 40 years waiting for interesting things to walk through his door. He looked up from the glass case he was arranging when she came in. She set the dish towel on the counter without preamble and unrolled it. Roscoe Fitch looked at the 3 birds. He looked at them for a moment without speaking, and something shifted in his face, some quality of professional attention, becoming something else, something more personal. He did not touch them at first. He looked at the canvas back first, then the shorebird, then the bufflehead, and then back to the canvas back, and he reached up and took his glasses down from his hair and put them on and leaned forward over the counter. He turned the canvas back over with two fingers, gently the way you handle something you already suspect you have no business touching casually. He saw the brand. The letters S and G inside the outline of a flying bird burned into the smooth cypress bottom. He sat down on the stool behind the counter, not slowly the way an elderly man lowers himself onto a seat, suddenly as if his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. He said very quietly, "Where did you get these?" Vivian told him, "The shanty at Heron's Point, the Graves place. Her husband had owned it for 11 years before he died, and she had owned it for 17 years since. And 4 days ago, she had opened a hidden panel in the inland wall and found 31 of them wrapped in oilcloth on 3 shelves in the dark." Roscoe Fitch took his glasses off. He set them on the counter beside the canvas back and was quiet for long enough that Vivian began to feel the particular discomfort of not knowing whether the silence was good or bad. Then he told her. Solomon Graves, he said, was not a name the wider world knew. But in the small and serious world of people who study Chesapeake Bay decoys, who track the makers and the styles and the provenance of the working birds that had come out of this region across 150 years of waterfowling history, Solomon Graves was something that occupied the space between legend and tragedy. A handful of his working decoys survived in private collections. 2 were in museums, enough to establish beyond any question what kind of carver he had been. But it had been understood for decades that his finest work, the decorative birds he was said to have made in the last years of his life, had been lost when the Graves property fell to ruin after his death in 1961. People had searched Heron's Point, not recently, but years ago when the story was still alive in local memory. They had found the shanty locked and deteriorating and had assumed the contents, if there had ever been any, were long gone to weather and time and scavengers. That search, Roscoe said, had clearly been inadequate. He picked up the canvas back again. He held it near the window light and turned it, watching what the light did to the surface. He said that the comb painting alone, the technique of dragging a tool through wet paint to suggest individual feathers, was something Solomon Graves had developed independently and that no other maker in the region had ever quite replicated. He said that the eyes, the angle at which they were set, was a Graves signature so distinctive that specialists used it for attribution when the brand was absent. He set the bird down. He said he could not put a number on what she had. That was not his place and not his competence. What she needed was a specialist in American folk art at the highest level, someone who handled this category of object through one of the serious auction houses. He knew such a person. Her name was Dr. Lenora Vane, and she worked out of Philadelphia, and she was the most respected authority in the country on Chesapeake decoys as folk art objects. He would make a call if Vivian wanted him to. Then he asked almost shyly if he might see the ledger. Vivian took it out of the Ziploc bag and set it on the counter. Roscoe opened it with the care of someone handling a thing that has already told him it is fragile, and he read the first page, and he read the single line Solomon had written below his name in 1911. He closed the ledger gently. He took his glasses off again and looked out the window at the main street of Wexford for a long moment. When he turned back, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the shop's fluorescent lighting. He said that whatever the birds were worth, and he believed the number would surprise her, the ledger might prove to be worth more than all of them. Not in money, but in what it was. A complete record of a vanished craft and a vanished practice, written in the hand of the man who had lived both covering 50 years of a life that the historical record had almost entirely missed. He said that institutions would want it. He said that the story it contained was the kind of story that did not survive unless someone like Vivian had kept a promise they didn't understand for 17 years. He told her one thing more before she left, leaning forward slightly to say it, the way people lean forward when what they're saying matters enough to close the distance. Whatever you do, he said, do not sell anything to anyone who comes to your door. Word of a find like this travels, and it does not always travel to people who come with good intentions. Go through proper channels or go wrong. Those are the only 2 options with something like this. Vivian drove back to Heron's Point that afternoon with the name Dr. Lenora Vane written on a card in her coat pocket, and a feeling she had learned over the years not to trust too quickly. Hope was expensive. She had paid for it before, and she knew the cost. So she went to work. The roof was the most urgent problem because a building with a failing roof is a building in the process of dying, and whatever was in that workshop was not going to survive another winter of water coming through the peeled back corner of tin. She spent that evening watching repair videos on her phone in the car, where the signal held, and the next morning she drove to the county hardware store in Wexford and bought what she needed, charging it to the credit card she had been slowly paying down for a decade. She was up the ladder at first light with salvaged sections of tin from the collapsed shed. She learned from her mistakes. The first seam leaked. She pulled it and reset it. The second held. By mid-afternoon, she had covered the failed section, screwed it down, and run a bead of roofing sealant along every edge. And when she came down the ladder, her shoulders had a deep ache that she recognized as the kind that would still be there in a week. When it rained 2 days later, the workshop stayed dry for the first time in years, and Vivian stood inside listening to the water run correctly off her own work and felt something she had not felt since the motel closed, which was useful. Cody held the ladder through all of it, steadying it when the wind came off the bay, handing tools up when she called for them. He was simply present in the way that useful people are present, attending to what was needed without requiring direction. On the second day of the roof work, sitting on overturned crates at lunch with sandwiches she had made on the camp stove, she asked him his full name again. Not because she had forgotten it, because she needed to hear it in the context of what she now knew. He said it the same way he had said it the first time. Cody Marsh, flat and plain, with the economy of someone who has learned to give information in the smallest useful doses. She went inside. She came back with the ledger. She opened it to the entry she had found 2 nights ago and set it on the crate in front of him. He looked at the page. He read it. He read it again. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but something went out of it. Some quality of held tension, like a fist that has been clenched long enough that when it finally opens, the person doesn't notice it opening. The entry recorded Darrow Marsh arriving in the summer of 1964 at 16 years old. The anger in him is only grief with nowhere to go. That he learned quickly and his hands were good, that he went back to the county by fall with money enough to see his mother through the winter, and that he came back the following spring and was the kind of young man who, when shown something once, did not need to be shown again. Cody read it 3 times. Then he looked up at Vivian. She told him that Darrow Marsh was almost certainly his grandfather, based on the dates in the county, and that whoever had been keeping the shanty after Solomon died had written his grandfather's name in the ledger, because that was what the ledger was for, recording everyone who came through and what had been seen in them and what happened after. Cody looked back at the page. He put his finger on the line about the anger. He read it again. He said his grandfather had never talked much about his own history. He said the old man had told him once that there was a place on the water where he had learned the only useful thing he ever knew, but he had never said what the place was or what the thing was, only that it had kept him alive through a bad time and that he wished he had gone back. Cody lifted his hand from the page. He said quietly that his grandfather had died 3 years ago. Vivian closed the ledger and left it on the crate beside him and went back up the ladder. She did not look back down. She knew without looking that Cody Marsh was sitting on the overturned crate in the March sunlight, with his grandfather's name in a dead man's handwriting, open on his knees, having the particular experience of discovering that the place you ended up by accident was the place someone who loved you had meant to bring you all along. After that, something changed in how Cody moved through the shanty and the work. He had been helping before, careful and adequate, the way of a person paying a debt they feel they owe. Now he moved with something else, a quality of investment that had nothing to do with legal title. He went into the workshop in the evenings and stayed. She only noticed the second evening that one of the small, rough-cut blocks from the open shelves was missing from its place, and that there were fresh wood shavings on the floor beside the workbench. She left the ledger on the bench where he could read it. She read Solomon's craft notes aloud to him sometimes in the evenings, not as instruction, simply because the passages were good, and she wanted to share something that struck her as true. One evening she read his description of the comb stroke, the way of dragging a tool through wet paint to suggest individual feathers, and she read his notes on the weight distribution that made a well-made decoy self-right after a wave without human help. She read for half an hour. When she looked up, Cody was not working the wood down to nothing the way he usually did. He was shaping something. The rough suggestion of a bird's body had emerged from the block, crude still, but unmistakably intentional. The outlines of a head and neck differentiating themselves from the mass of the wood with a purpose that had not been there an hour before. She said nothing about it. She closed the ledger and said goodnight and went to her bedroll. She lay in the dark listening to the rain and thought about Leonard sitting in that canvas chair with his thermos of coffee, keeping a secret for reasons she still didn't fully understand. And she thought about Solomon writing in 1911 that a decoy's only job was to bring the others home. And she tried to find the shape of the thing she was inside of the structure of it. She was beginning to think the shape was larger than she'd understood when she first pulled that panel off the wall. Dr. Lenora Vane arrived from Philadelphia 11 days after Roscoe made the call. She drove a dark blue sedan and came into the shanty with a soft-sided case that held a loupe, a UV light, a set of reference photographs printed on archival paper, and a notebook she wrote in with a mechanical pencil. She spent 2 full days. She examined each of the 31 birds from the hidden cabinet with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the work she was doing had consequences and that getting it wrong was not an option. She examined the paint surfaces under the loupe and under the UV light, looking for any sign of overpainting or restoration. She found none, which she told Vivian mattered more than almost anything else, because original painted surface was the primary determinant of value in this category of object. And these birds had spent 60 years sealed dry in a stable wall environment that had preserved them as completely as museum conditions could have managed. She cross-referenced the SG brand against her records. She measured the dimensions of each bird against the known measurements of the 2 Solomon Graves decoys in museum collections. She read the ledger twice, and the second time she read it, she stopped speaking entirely for the better part of an hour. Vivian made coffee and left it on the bench beside her and went outside. On the evening of the second day, Dr. Vane sat across from Vivian at the old workbench and told her she wanted to be precise, because precision was the only form of respect adequate to a discovery of this nature. The 31 birds from the hidden cabinet, she said, were not working decoys. They were Solomon Graves's masterworks, the late decorative carvings the field had believed lost for more than 60 years. Taken together, they constituted the single most significant discovery of Chesapeake folk art she had handled in a career spanning nearly 3 decades. She would need months and other specialists to complete a formal appraisal. Auction outcomes were unpredictable. She would give Vivian a conservative working range and nothing more. She opened her notebook and wrote a figure on a page and turned it around on the bench. The conservative low end of the estimated range was $280,000. The high end was $510,000. Vivian read the numbers twice. She looked up at Dr. Vane, who nodded once, confirming that Vivian had read them correctly. Outside the shanty, the marsh stretched flat and indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. The cordgrass bending in the afternoon wind, the tidal channels catching the light in long silver lines that did not care what they reflected. Dr. Vane added quietly that the ledger was in some respects the more important find. The birds would go to collectors where they belonged, where they would be cared for and studied. But the ledger was a document, the most complete first-person record of the Chesapeake decoy craft she knew of, written by the man who had practiced it at its highest level across 5 decades, and it contained in addition a human record, the names and the stories of every boy Solomon had taken in, that belonged not in a private collection, but in an institution where it could be preserved and understood by people who would come after all of them. The Chesapeake Wildfowl Heritage Museum in Easton, she said, would build a wing around it. She would help Vivian see that done correctly if Vivian wanted her help. Vivian said she would think about all of it. She walked Dr. Vane to her car and stood on the causeway and watched the dark blue sedan make its way back toward the county road. She stood there for a long time after the car disappeared around the curve, where the marsh grass closed in on both sides. She had spent 9 years cleaning 11 rooms a day for wages that barely covered the room above the hardware store, and the annual tax bill on a piece of land she had never visited. And a woman from Philadelphia had just written a number on a notebook page that made all of that look like a very long approach to a door she hadn't known was there. She went back inside. Cody was at the bench with the block he had been working on for 3 days. The draw knife in his hand, the wood coming down towards something she was beginning to recognize as a bird. The head was distinct now, the neck flowing into the body with a curve that was not perfect, but was unmistakably intentional. The work of someone who had an image in his mind and was working toward it. She told him the birds were going to need careful handling and that she was going to need help keeping the workshop secure until she had made some decisions. He said that was fine. He said he wasn't going anywhere. Word came to Wexford the way words come in small counties, moving through ordinary channels, a conversation here and an overheard remark there. Roscoe Fitch had told someone. Dr. Vane's visit had been observed. The condemnation notice missing from the shanty door had been noted. People came down the oyster shell causeway, one and two at a time, in the careful sideways manner of marsh country people approaching something they're not sure about. The first was Harlan Doss, 81 years old, who drove a pickup with more rust than paint and sat in it for 10 minutes before getting out. He looked at the shanty for a long time without speaking. Then he said his father had learned to carve in that building. He said it the way men of his generation say large things plainly, as if the plainness were its own form of respect. And then he had to stop and look out at the water. His father had been one of Solomon's boys. A waterman drowned in a winter squall left 3 sons with no food, and his father, 14 years old, had walked 9 miles to Heron's Point because someone had told him the old man there sometimes took on boys who needed work. Solomon Graves had taken him on and taught him the birds, and his father had sold enough that winter to keep the family together. And he had lived to 91 years old and never once told the story without his voice failing somewhere in the middle of it. Vivian took Harlan inside. She found his father's name in the ledger in Solomon's labored hand, the entry from the winter of 1923, and she showed him the line Solomon had written beneath the name, a thing he had noticed about a 14-year-old boy 100 years ago. Harlan Doss put his hand flat on the page. He pressed it there as if to feel the words through his palm. And he did not try to hide that he was weeping because he was 81 years old and had earned the right to feel things without apology. Others came after him. A retired schoolteacher named Lucinda Farr, whose grandfather's name appeared in the 1931 entries. A waterman in his late 50s named Seb Ensley, who still ran crab pots out of the next gut over, and whose family had been carried through one bad winter in the 1940s by a dozen of Solomon's birds given to his great-grandmother to sell. They came and they stood in the workshop and they read their own family names in the ledger, and they were quiet in the way of people who have just discovered that something they half believed was real. Vivian watched them and thought about what Solomon had built here. Not the birds, not the craft, but this, the long thread of connection running forward through time, from his hand to theirs. A thread so fine you could spend your whole life not knowing you were holding it. She did not have time to stay in the feeling, because 11 days after Dr. Lenora Vane drove back to Philadelphia, a black SUV that did not belong to anyone in Corwin County came down the Oyster Shell Causeway and stopped in front of the shanty. The man who stepped out was named Sterling Voss. He wore the kind of clothes that cost enough to be inconspicuous about it, the easy, expensive look of a man who has learned that appearing relaxed is its own form of leverage. He said he was a private dealer in fine sporting collectibles, that he worked with serious collectors who valued discretion, and that he had heard a fascinating rumor about a discovery out this way and had simply had to come and see for himself. He was charming. He admired the shanty. He called it characterful, with the particular warmth of someone deploying a word they have chosen to make the other person feel good about something that is not in fact good. He stepped inside and looked at the working decoys on the open shelves with an expression of mild, appreciative interest, turning one or two over in his hands, and he did not so much as glance at the inland wall, which told Vivian, who had spent 9 years reading people in motel rooms, exactly how much he already knew and what he was pretending not to know. He came to the point gently. He understood she had come into some antique folk pieces, he said. Charming objects, certainly, but a specialized market, Very thin condition, always a problem with things that had been sitting in an unheated structure for decades. He would hate to see her get her hopes up. He liked her. He liked the story. He was prepared to offer $42,000 cash for the lot birds, and that old account book included sight largely unseen as a favor. No auction fees, no waiting, no taxes to puzzle through. A life-changing sum, he said, for a box of old duck decoys. He even smiled when he said it, the smile of a man who has already finished underestimating the person across from him and is simply waiting for the paperwork. $42,000 for 31 masterworks, and a ledger a museum would build a wing around. Vivian looked at Sterling Voss's warm and certain face and thought about Solomon Graves watching the sky go empty over his punt gun year by year, learning what it meant when the men who took without understanding told you the thing you had was worth less than it was. They always said that, right up until the moment they owned it. She told him no thank you. He raised the number. She said no again. He raised it once more, the warmth thinning each time like a solution being diluted. And when Sterling Voss finally understood that the woman in the thin coat was not going to be talked out of her own dead husband's promise, something went out of his face the way a tide runs off a flat. The last thing he said before he got back in the black SUV was not quite a threat, but it sat in the air like one. He said it would be a shame if the question of who actually owned these items got complicated. Vivian watched the SUV make its way back along the causeway and disappear around the curve in the marsh grass. Cody came around the corner of the building and stood beside her looking at the settling dust. He said, "Who was that?" She said, "Someone who thought I didn't understand what I had." Cody looked at the causeway a moment longer. Then he went back to what he had been doing without asking anything more. 9 days later, the letter came. It arrived at the Wexford post office box she still maintained forwarded there because Herons Point had no mail service. It was from a law office in Baltimore filed on behalf of Prescott Alcott and Blythe Alcott Farrow. Prescott was Leonard's older brother. Blythe was his younger sister. They had not spoken to Vivian with any warmth in the 17 years since Leonard died. They had not contributed a single dollar to the annual property taxes on the Herons Point parcel. They had not visited the property once, not in the 11 years between when Leonard bought it and when he died, and not in the 17 years since. But 31 birds with a conservative estimated value of $280,000 had changed what the shanty was to them, the way a buried thing changes everything the moment it is dug up. The claim was that the decoy collection constituted undisclosed assets of Leonard Alcott's estate assets that should have been inventoried and distributed at the time of settlement, and that Vivian's possession of them was therefore legally improper. They were asking the court to freeze any sale and to order the collection divided 3 ways among Leonard's heirs. Vivian read the letter in the station wagon in the post office parking lot. She read it with the particular clarity of a person who has had enough experience with being maneuvered to recognize the shape of it immediately. The claim was constructed. The decoys had not been undisclosed. They had not been disclosed because no living person had known they existed. Not the estate attorneys, not the court, not even Vivian herself, until she opened a wall 17 years after Leonard died. You cannot disclose what you do not know exists. But a constructed claim filed with a court still has to be answered. It still costs money and time and sleep. And the money combined with the uncertainty of an ongoing legal proceeding might be enough to make a woman in Vivian's circumstances accept the first reasonable settlement offered, preferably one arranged through a private dealer willing to handle the distribution quietly. She understood the sequence. Sterling Voss had made his call the same day he left Herons Point. She drove to the county seat and found a law office on the street behind the courthouse. The attorney's name was Theodora Reeve, a woman in her late 40s with the unhurried manner of someone who has handled enough cases to know that most of them resolved not in the courtroom, but in the quality of preparation brought to it. She listened to Vivian for 45 minutes without interrupting, read the claim letter twice, and then asked to see the original documentation from Leonard's estate. Vivian brought her everything she had: the will, the estate settlement papers that Prescott and Blythe had both signed 17 years ago, acknowledging receipt of their respective bequests, the deed to the Herons Point property showing clear title transfer to Vivian, and the strong box from Tidewater Savings, which she had not opened in 3 years, which contained Leonard's personal papers. Theodora Reeve went through the strong box methodically. She read each document and set it aside. And then near the bottom under a folded copy of the deed, she found a document Vivian had not known was there. It was a single page, typed with Leonard's signature at the bottom and 2 witness signatures beside it, and a notary seal from the same month and year that Leonard had bought the shanty at the county tax sale. 11 years before his death. Filed in the strong box at the back of everything else, never mentioned to anyone. Theodora read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it on the desk and turned it so Vivian could read it. It was simple, written in Leonard's manner, plain and direct without legal ornamentation. It stated that the property at Heron's Point in Corwin County, Maryland, together with all structures upon it and all contents therein, known and unknown, discovered and undiscovered, was left to his wife Vivian Alcott, alone and entire. It stated that this was his clear and deliberate wish, and that he made it with full understanding that the property might in time prove to hold value he could not himself yet measure. And it stated in the final sentence that any person who attempted to divide or diminish this bequest after his death would be acting against the most deliberate intention of his life. Known and unknown, discovered and undiscovered. He had chosen those words on purpose. A boat mechanic who fixed engines for a living, who found conversation difficult and sentiment embarrassing, who had never been able to explain himself in the 14 years they were married, had sat down with a lawyer on the same day he bought the shanty and found the most precise language available to him. He had written a document that said, in effect, whatever is in that building is hers, regardless of what it turns out to be. He had built a legal wall around the physical wall, and he had sealed it in a bank box and never spoken of it to anyone, trusting that if the day came when it mattered, someone would find it. She had been the one to find it. 17 years after he died, standing at a bank counter in Wexford, holding the most careful thing he ever wrote. Vivian stood at the counter with the document in her hands and looked at it for a long time. Outside the window of Tidewater Savings, the main street of Wexford went about its ordinary business. A truck idled at the light. 2 women talked outside the pharmacy. The day proceeded in its ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that a man dead 17 years had just reached across all that time and answered a question his widow had stopped letting herself ask. Why Leonard? Why this place? Why the promise? Why me? Because he had known or suspected or simply loved her well enough to plan for the possibility that someday what was hidden in that wall would be worth fighting for, and that when that day came, she would need more than a handwritten note in the band of a fishing hat. She drove back to Heron's Point in the late afternoon. The marsh was gold in the low light, the cordgrass catching the last of the sun, the tidal channels running dark between the lit banks. The causeway crunched under her tires in the ceremonial rhythm she had come to think of as the sound of arriving somewhere that was hers. She pulled up in front of the shanty and sat for a moment with the engine off. She thought about Leonard at 46 buying a falling down shack for $300 and sitting down that same day to write the most precise thing he would ever write against a future he could not see clearly but understood was coming. She thought about what it took to do that, to act so exactly for someone else's benefit in a moment no one was watching, with no certainty that the action would ever be needed. That was the half of him that had been out here all along. Inside the workshop, the lamp on the bench threw warm yellow light through the repaired window. Cody was at the bench. He had the draw knife in his hand and the block of pine before him, and it was no longer a block of pine. It had become in the rough but unmistakable form of a thing beginning to declare what it is: a duck. A black duck, broad-bodied and low the head, just roughed in the breast curve, still unrefined but already possessing the particular gravity of a real bird at rest on water. He had not been taught to do this. He had only read the ledger and picked up the tools and begun. Vivian looked at the rough carving for a moment. Then she looked at the boy holding it. Then she set the envelope from the bank on the bench beside him. She told him that Prescott Alcott and Blythe Alcott Farrow had decided the birds belonged to them too. She told him she had a lawyer and the law was on her side. She told him she had found something at the bank that morning that Leonard had left for her a long time ago, something that was going to matter when the case went before a judge. Cody looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He asked if she was going to be all right. She said yes. She said she thought Leonard had made sure of that in his quiet way a long time before either of them had any reason to think it would be necessary. Cody nodded. He turned the rough duck in his hands and looked at it with the appraising attention of a person measuring the distance between what a thing is and what it is trying to become. Outside, the tide was coming in. It filled the marsh channels with its familiar sound, that vast, soft seething that Vivian had come to think of as the sound of Heron's Point itself, the sound it made when it was breathing. The lamp threw their two shadows up the cypress wall long and steady, and the 31 birds sat on the shelves behind the open panel, and the ledger lay on the bench between them, open to the first page, where Solomon Graves had written in 1911 the line that had turned out to be true about all of it. A decoy's only job is to bring the others home. Tomorrow there would be a courtroom to walk into. Tonight the marsh breathed around them, and the lamp held the dark back, and in Cody's hands the rough shape of a bird was becoming slowly, stubbornly, unmistakably itself. The courthouse in the county seat of Corwin County was a brick building from 1887, 3 stories with a cupola that had lost its weather vane sometime in the previous century and never had it replaced. The courtroom on the second floor smelled of floor wax and the particular dry heat of old radiators, working too hard against a cold morning, and the wooden benches in the gallery had been polished by 100 years of people sitting in them and waiting for things to be decided. Vivian arrived at 8:15 with Theodora Reeve, who carried a single thin folder, and moved through the marble corridor with the unhurried calm of someone who already knows how the morning will end. They did not speak much. Theodora had said what needed to be said in 2 meetings in her office, and Vivian had learned the shape of the case well enough that there was nothing left to rehearse. Prescott Alcott and Blythe Alcott Farrow arrived at 8:30 with their Baltimore attorney, a man named Clifford Hayne, who wore a suit that announced itself and carried a briefcase that contained, Vivian suspected, a great deal of paper arranged to create the impression of a more substantial argument than actually existed. Prescott had the heavy, settled look of a man who had spent his life believing that confidence and entitlement were the same quality. Blythe was thinner and more careful, the kind of careful that comes from watching someone else be too loud for too long and deciding to operate differently while pursuing the same ends. They sat at the plaintiff's table and arranged themselves with the ease of people who believe the proceedings are a formality. Neither of them looked at Vivian, and then from the back of the courtroom came the sound of the gallery door opening. Harlan Doss came in first, moving slowly with the deliberate care of an 81-year-old man who has decided that slow and present is better than fast and absent. He was wearing a dark coat she had not seen before his good coat, and he chose a seat in the second row and settled into it with a stillness that had weight to it. Behind him came Seb Ensley, still in his work boots, because he had come straight from the water, and Lucinda Farr in a wool coat the color of a winter sky. And 4 others Vivian recognized from the weeks of visitors at the Shanty people, whose grandfathers' names were in Solomon's ledger, people who had driven out to Heron's Point and stood in the workshop and put their hands on the page that held their family's history. Nobody had called them. Nobody had organized their coming. They had heard the way things are heard in Corwin County through the quiet channels of a community that has been paying attention to the same families for a very long time, and they had come because the thing being decided in this courtroom had something to do with them, even if the law did not officially recognize it. They sat together in the back of the gallery in their good clothes, and they did not make any noise at all, and the sight of them sitting there said something that no attorney would have known how to say in a courtroom. Judge Cecilia Morrow took the bench at 9 o'clock. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who grew up in a place like this and went away and came back and had been deciding things ever since. She had grown up 2 counties south in a waterman's family, and she knew exactly what a gunning shanty was and exactly what it meant when one sat deteriorating on a marsh point for 17 years, while the people who now claimed an interest in it had not once driven down its causeway. Clifford Hayne made his argument first. The decoy collection, he said, constituted assets of Leonard Alcott's estate that had not been properly inventoried or distributed at the time of his death. The fact that their existence had not been known at the time was, he argued, an argument for revisiting the settlement rather than against it. Equity demanded, he said, that a windfall of this magnitude not accrue entirely to one heir at the expense of others. He used the word fairness several times, each time applying it to his client's feelings rather than their conduct, which was a rhetorical choice that Judge Morrow received without visible reaction. Then Theodora Reeves stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not use the word fairness. She placed Leonard Alcott's supplemental property statement in front of the judge, and she read the operative language aloud clearly and at a pace that allowed every word to settle before the next one arrived. All contents therein known and unknown, discovered and undiscovered, to my wife Vivian Alcott alone. She noted that this document had been signed, witnessed, and notarized 11 years before Leonard Alcott's death, which was 17 years before any bird was found, which made it impossible to characterize as anything other than the testator's deliberate and forward-looking intent established at the precise moment he acquired the property. She noted that Prescott Alcott and Blythe Alcott Farrow had received their own specific bequests from Leonard's estate 17 years ago. They had been present at the reading of the will. They had reviewed the estate inventory. They had signed their releases and accepted their portions and walked out of the attorney's office without raising any question about the Herons Point property, which at that time had been assessed at $0 and which they had, to all available evidence, found entirely uninteresting. She noted without raising her voice and without editorial comment that neither Prescott Alcott nor Blythe Alcott Farrow had visited the property at any point in the 17 years since Leonard's death, that neither had contributed to its annual property taxes, which Vivian Alcott had paid consistently from her own wages year after year on a credit card she paid down slowly every month, because a promise was a promise, that neither had expressed any interest in the property or its history or its contents until the moment those contents proved to have significant monetary value. Then she sat down because there was nothing else that needed to be said. Judge Morrow read Leonard's supplemental statement once. Then she read it again more slowly. She set it on the bench in front of her and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Clifford Hayne. She asked him whether he would like to respond to the specific language of the document. He said that the document, while thorough, could not have anticipated the nature or magnitude of the discovered assets. She asked him whether he was arguing that a testator's clearly expressed intent should be set aside when the undiscovered contents of a property turned out to be more valuable than expected. He began to answer, and she let him finish, and then she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Prescott Alcott and Blythe Alcott Farrow directly, not at their attorney, at them, and she said what she had decided. She said the will was unambiguous. She said the supplemental property statement was among the most clearly expressed declarations of testatorial intent she had encountered in her years on the bench, and that its specific inclusion of the phrase known and unknown, discovered and undiscovered, demonstrated a degree of foresight that the law was obligated to respect. She said the claim of undisclosed assets failed on its face because a thing cannot be disclosed that no living person knew existed, and that the testator had plainly contemplated that exact circumstance and provided for it in explicit language 17 years before anyone opened a wall. She dismissed the claim in its entirety, and then she added one thing more, and she said it looking not at the lawyers, but at Prescott and Blythe themselves with the directness of a woman who grew up in a place where people said what they meant because they had to live among the people they said it to. She said that in her experience, money revealed people more reliably than hardship ever did. That hardship could be endured and survived and even ennobled, but that money, specifically the sudden proximity of money one had not earned, had a way of showing a person's character with a clarity that left very little room for ambiguity. She said that Prescott Alcott and Blythe Alcott Farrow might wish to sit with what their conduct in this matter had revealed about them. Not to her, to themselves. Then she moved to the next matter on her docket, and it was over. The gavel came down, and Vivian sat very still for a moment in the hard wooden chair while the courtroom reorganized itself around her. Theodora gathered her single folder. Clifford Haynes spoke in a low voice to his clients who were listening with the faces of people receiving information they had not prepared for. Blythe Alcott Farrow looked once at Vivian across the room, a look that carried in it the ruins of something she might have said if she had found the words in time. An explanation, perhaps, or something that could have passed for an apology. Then she looked away, and the moment closed. Prescott did not look at Vivian at all. In the gallery, Harlan Doss let out a long breath that he seemed to have been holding since he sat down. Seb Ensley put a hand on the old man's shoulder. Lucinda Farr folded her hands in her lap with the expression of someone whose faith in a particular kind of justice has been for once confirmed. Vivian did not cry. She had not cried in 17 years, and she did not cry now. She simply sat for one more moment in the courtroom that smelled of floor wax and radiator heat and let the fact of it become real at the pace it needed to the way large, true things have to be given the time to become real, or they remain only ideas. The shanty was hers, completely and officially, and finally the way it had always been. She thanked Theodora in the corridor. Theodora said there was nothing to thank, that the case had rested on Leonard's foresight and not her own, and that she hoped Vivian would call her if she ever needed anything else. They shook hands with the warmth of two women who have been through something together and emerged on the right side of it. Outside, Harlan Doss waited on the courthouse steps in the cold April sunlight. He did not say anything when Vivian came out. He only nodded once, the way men of his generation nod when words would be insufficient, and they know it, and Vivian nodded back, and that was enough. The birds sold over the following 6 months through Dr. Lenora Vane's careful management. Vivian did not take the first offer on anything. She had waited 17 years and could wait a little longer for the right hands. The canvas-back drake, the one she had unwrapped first in the gray light of that March afternoon, went to a collector in Connecticut who had been searching for a Solomon Graves piece for 30 years and who paid for it without negotiating, because he understood that you do not negotiate for the thing you have been waiting your whole adult life to find. The shorebirds went as a flock to a folk art gallery in Annapolis that had been building a Chesapeake collection over the course of a decade. The two swans went to a museum endowment in Baltimore, whose board voted unanimously on the acquisition within 48 hours of seeing the photographs. The great canvas-back hen, the finest of all 31 birds, the one with a surface so alive it seemed less carved than grown, went to auction through Dr. Vane's house in Philadelphia on a Thursday morning in September. And the number the room went quiet to hear was more than any single thing Vivian Alcott had ever imagined her name attached to. When the last of it cleared after commissions and after the taxes she paid to the dollar, because Solomon Graves's ledger had taught her that an honest accounting was its own form of dignity, the total came to $447,000. She did not do with it what anyone expected. She did not buy a new house first. She did not pay off the credit card first, though she did that in October without ceremony. She did not take a trip or replace the station wagon or do any of the things a person does when a long, grinding scarcity finally ends. The first thing she did was call a carpenter named Walt Doss Harlan's grandson, who did fine work and lived in the next county over, and she hired him to repair the shanty, not to renovate it, not to update it or improve it or make it into something different from what it had always been. To repair it, to take the structure that Solomon Graves had built to last and bring it back to the condition in which it had been built to last. Walt came and looked at it for 2 full days before he told her what he thought it needed, and she listened carefully and approved everything, and they began in May. The roof was made sound with new standing seam tin that matched the profile of the original. The leeward wall was jacked back to plumb on its iron-hard cypress sills, which had held for 100 years and showed every sign of holding for another 100. The collapsed shed was rebuilt from salvaged board and hand-cut timber, as close as Walt could make it to what the county historical photographs suggested it had originally looked like. The windows were reglazed with glass that had a slight waviness to it, the kind made by a process already old when Solomon Graves was young. The workbench was clean but not refinished. Vivian was specific about this. She told Walt that the worn valleys in the bench surface were the record of every hand that had ever worked there, and that sanding them away would be the same as erasing names from a book, and that she would not have it done. Walt, who was a craftsman himself and understood the principle without needing it, explained at length, cleaned the bench with linseed oil, and left its surface exactly as it was. The tools were taken down from their board, cleaned and sharpened one at a time, and rehung in their outlined positions. The grinding wheel in the corner was oiled and its treadle mechanism adjusted until it turned freely. The shelves were cleaned and left empty and ready. In the first week of June, Vivian drove the ledger to the Chesapeake Wildfowl Heritage Museum in Easton, in the archival box Dr. Vane had provided. She met with the museum's director and its curator of folk art in a room that smelled of climate-controlled air and careful preservation. She had one condition: a line from the ledger. Solomon's line, the one he had written on the first page in 1911, and again in a shaking hand near the end of his life, was to be carved into the wall above the display case, where the ledger would be exhibited in wood in letters large enough to be read from across the room, so that every person who came to see it would read it before they saw anything else. A decoy's only job is to bring the others home. The museum agreed without hesitation. Then the director asked, after he had heard the full story from Vivian in the careful way she told it, whether the museum might also tell the story of Leonard Alcott. Not as a footnote, as part of the main narrative. The man who had bought a $0 shanty at a county tax sale because his grandfather had once been one of Solomon's boys, who had kept the secret for 11 years and made his wife promise to keep it for 17 more, who had found a lawyer and written a document and sealed it in a bank box against a day he would not live to see. Vivian said yes, and that was how Leonard Alcott, a boat mechanic from Corwin County who had found words difficult his entire life, came to have his name on a museum wall in Easton, Maryland, beside the name of the man he had spent his life quietly honoring. She opened the Graves Shanty Workshop on the first Saturday of July. There was no ceremony, no announcement in the county paper, no ribbon cutting, no official opening. Vivian had told people by word of mouth through Harlan and Seb and Lucinda and Roscoe Fitch that the shanty on Heron's Point would be open on Saturday mornings to children who wanted to learn to carve, that there was no cost, that breakfast would be provided, and that anyone who showed up would be put to work. 7 children came the first Saturday. 12 came the second. By the third Saturday, there were 16 ranging in age from 9 to 15, and Vivian had set up 2 additional work tables in the repaired shed using the long planks Walt had salvaged from the original structure. Harlan Doss came twice a week and sat at the end of the workbench and showed the children how to read the grain of a block of white cedar before the knife ever touched it, how to feel with your thumb for the direction the wood wanted to move, so the tool went with it instead of against it. He was not a man who explained things with many words. He was a man who put his hands over a child's hands and moved them slowly through the correct motion until the motion became familiar and then let go. Seb Ensley came on Thursdays and taught them to hollow a body, how to remove the material from beneath so the bird would ride low and true, how to fit the bottom board, how to set the lead keel so the decoy would self-right after a wave, instead of floating upside down with its belly to the sky, which Solomon had written in the ledger spooked the live birds worse than no decoy at all. Roscoe Fitch closed his shop on Saturdays and drove the 9 miles out, and he brought examples from his collection working decoys by known Chesapeake makers that the children could hold and examine and compare to their own rough early efforts. He was a patient teacher, more patient with children than with adults, as if children deserved a standard of care that grown people had to earn. Vivian fed them first. Every Saturday before a knife was picked up or a block of wood was examined, there was breakfast. Oatmeal in the colder months, eggs and toast as the season warmed, juice and coffee for the adults. She had read Solomon's ledger closely enough to know that you cannot put a tool in a hungry child's hands and expect them to learn anything from it except frustration. She charged nothing. She marked everything in a new ledger she kept on the bench, a plain cloth-bound book from the stationery store in Wexford, in her own careful hand. The wood, the meals, the sharpening steel, the blocks of cedar she ordered from a supplier in Virginia. not as charity because Solomon had thought charity an insult to the person receiving it, as wages paid in advance against work that would never be asked for. The children were the ones the county had a way of losing track of, the same ones really that Solomon Graves had been pulling in from the cold for 50 years before anyone thought to call it anything. Children whose fathers had left, or whose mothers were ill, or whose home situations were the kind that produced in a child a watchful, self-contained quality that adults who weren't paying attention often mistook for hostility. Children who had learned to make themselves small in rooms because small was safer than visible. Vivian noticed them the way she had always noticed things, with the quiet, observational attention of a woman who had spent 9 years reading the condition of rooms other people had been living in. She noticed which children ate quickly and which ate slowly, and what that told her. She noticed which ones flinched when an adult moved suddenly, and what that told her. She noticed which ones had the hollow look of children who had not slept well in a long time. And she made sure those children were never the last to be helped. There was a girl that first season named Petra, 10 years old, who came down the causeway on a borrowed bicycle the second Saturday and stood at the edge of the yard for 20 minutes before she came in. She was thin in the purposeful way of a child who has learned to take up as little space as possible, and she would not meet anyone's eyes for the better part of a month. She sat at the end of the bench and held her block of wood and made very little progress for the first 3 Saturdays. And Vivian watched her and said nothing about the progress, because what the girl needed was not to be told she was failing, which she already knew, but to be in a room where failing was understood as the first part of learning and not as a verdict on what you were. On the 4th Saturday, Harlan Doss sat beside Petra without announcing that he was going to do so, the way he did everything simply and without ceremony. He put his large, work-worn hands over her small ones and guided the draw knife through the cedar block in a long, pulling stroke, and the wood came away in a clean curl, and the curve of a duck's breast emerged from the surface, as if it had been waiting there the whole time for someone patient enough to find it. Petra looked at what her hands had just made. Then she looked at her hands themselves the way a person looks at something that has just done something they didn't know it could do. Vivian was at the stove at the far end of the workshop, and she turned back to the stove and busied herself with nothing in particular for a while, because there are moments that belong entirely to the person having them, and the best thing a bystander can do is look somewhere else. Cody had become, in the months since March, a natural part of the workshop, in the way that certain people become a natural part of a place, not through any official designation, but through consistent presence and the gradual accumulation of small, useful acts. He set up the tables on Saturday mornings before anyone arrived. He kept the tools in order. He sharpened knives without being asked when he saw they needed it, handing them back to children with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned that the most useful help is the kind that doesn't announce itself. He was also by now unmistakably a carver. The black duck he had begun in that first month at the shanty had taken him through 2 more failed attempts before the 4th came right. He had not asked for help with any of them, though help was available. He had read Solomon's ledger, which described the process in plain technical language, and he had tried what the ledger described, and when it failed, he had tried it differently. And when that failed, he had looked at the failure carefully and tried to understand exactly where the problem was before trying again. It was the same approach Solomon had described using himself across decades of self-teaching, the approach of a person who understands that failure is information if you are paying close enough attention to it. The 4th black duck was good. Not masterwork good, not yet, but genuinely and undeniably good in the way of a thing made by someone who has begun to understand their own instrument. The body rode level in a bucket of water. The paint which Cody had mixed according to Solomon's formula in the ledger had the soft depth of a surface that has been thought about rather than merely covered. A collector who had heard about the Grave Shanty Workshop through Dr. Vane's network drove down from Annapolis on a Saturday in August and bought it for more than Cody had imagined anyone would pay for something he had made with his own 2 hands from a piece of wood. Cody stood in the doorway of the shanty holding the check for a long time. He looked at it with the expression of a person who has been told something they want very much to believe, but haven't yet fully allowed themselves to. Vivian came and stood beside him in the doorway. The marsh was loud in the August heat, alive in a way it wasn't in winter, and the light on the water channels was sharp and flat, and the real ducks were out there somewhere beyond the gut, visible as small dark shapes against the glare. She told him what to do with the money. She said it the same way she imagined that it had been said to every person who had stood in some version of this doorway for the past 100 years, with some version of this surprise in their hands. Keep your family off the cold, she said, and when you're able, bring the next one in. Cody looked at her. He looked back at the check. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, and he went back inside to the bench, and he picked up the draw knife, and he began the next one. In October, Vivian learned to carve. She had told herself for months that it was not her place, that she was the keeper of the space and the organizer of the instruction, and the person who made the oatmeal and paid the taxes, and that the actual making of the birds belonged to people with the skill and the lineage for it. She had told herself this with the particular conviction of a person who is afraid of being bad at something in front of other people. Harlan Doss found her one October afternoon standing alone in the workshop, looking at Solomon's tools on the board above the bench after the children had gone, and Cody had gone into town, and the Saturday light was going golden and long through the west-facing window. He did not ask her what she was thinking. He took 2 draw knives off the board and a block of white cedar from the shelf, and he sat down on the bench stool and set one knife in front of her and put the cedar between them and looked at her. He said Solomon had taught a great many people to carve who started later in life than she was, and with less cause to learn, and that the wood did not care how old a person's hands were as long as the hands were patient. So she let him teach her. She learned to read the grain of a block with her thumb before she ever brought a blade to it, feeling the subtle direction of the wood structure, understanding that every piece of cedar had a preference about how it wanted to be worked, and that going with that preference instead of against it was the difference between a tool that sang through the material and a tool that fought every inch. She learned the long pulling stroke of the draw knife and the shorter, more precise work of the spoke shave, and the way a gouge could reach a concave surface that no flat blade could touch. She was not good at it, not at first. She ruined more blocks than the children did, and she was not too proud to say so, and the children found this reassuring in a way that no amount of technical instruction could have been. Vivian Alcott ruining a block of cedar and laughing about it told them something more useful than technique. It told them that the failing was not the end of the attempt. She felt in the ruining and the laughing something go out of her shoulders that had been there for a very long time. The accumulated weight of 9 years of motel rooms and 17 years of smaller and smaller spaces, and the particular tired dignity of a woman who has made herself useful to other people for so long that she has forgotten to wonder what she herself might make. Her first finished bird took 11 weeks. It was a plain black duck, no decorative comb painting, no fancy glass eyes, just a working bird of the old useful kind, the type Solomon had made in his early years, before his skill grew beyond what the working market required. It was lumpish at the tail and slightly heavy on one side, faults she could see clearly and knew she would correct in the next one. When she set it in the half barrel of water she kept in the yard for testing, it wobbled. She held her breath. It rocked twice, 3 times, and then it found itself settled and sat there low and level, and entirely still looking out at the marsh, with the composed patience of a thing that knows exactly where it is. Vivian stood over the barrel in the November light and looked at the homely bird she had made, and she thought of the lines Solomon had written about the eyes, about how a calm bird calls the others down, about how a frightened bird brings nothing in. She thought about all the years she had been frightened and careful and small in rooms that belonged to other people. She thought about the canvas chair in the sealed workshop, and the note in the fishing hat, and the 17 years she had kept a promise she didn't understand, because the man who asked her to had loved her in the only language he fully possessed. She had ridden the worst water. She was still here, and she was at last entirely still. On the night before she drove the ledger to Easton, Vivian sat at the old workbench, alone with the lamp on and the ledger open on the worn surface in front of her. The workshop was quiet. The tide was out, and the marsh was still. Through the west window, she could see the stars over the bay, more of them than she ever saw from town. The full, undimmed thickness of them, stretching from horizon to horizon above the dark water. She turned to the last written page of the ledger, the page where Solomon had written his line in a shaking hand in the spring of 1959, and where the chain of keepers after him had added their names one by one across the decades, each one writing the same line beneath their name as every keeper before them had written. She read Leonard's entry, the blocky handwriting she would have known anywhere, his name and his line. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked up the pen she had brought from the stationery store in Wexford. A good pen, a pen that would last, and she wrote her own name on the next line, Vivian Alcott. And beneath it, because there was only one thing to write, and she had known what it was since the night she first read it by the light of a camp stove in March. A decoy's only job is to bring the others home. She closed the ledger. She put it back in Dr. Vane's archival box. She sat for a little while longer with the lamp on and the marsh quiet outside, and the shelves of the hidden cabinet standing open, their long work finally done. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed. On a warm evening in late November, after the children had gone home, and Harlan had taken his truck back up the causeway, and Cody had gone into Wexford for supplies, Vivian sat alone on the rebuilt dock at the end of the point, with her feet hanging over the dark water. She had brought the black duck she had made. She set it on the water beside the dock and let it go. It found its level immediately without wobbling and sat there on the dark surface of the gut with the composed stillness she had been working toward for 11 weeks. The tide was coming in, and the small current moved it gently, but it did not tip. It did not drift sideways. It sat the way a thing sits when it has been made correctly, with its weight in the right place and its center of gravity exactly where it needed to be, as if the water were a natural extension of the surface it had been made for all along. Vivian sat on the dock and looked at it. She thought about the hospital corridor. She thought about the note in the fishing hat and the long, cold years of small rooms, and the mornings she had driven out to Heron's Point with $96 and a promise she didn't understand. She thought about the panel of cypress she had pressed her palm against and felt given away. Solid walls don't give. She thought about the 31 birds emerging one at a time from the sealed dark, each one more remarkable than the last, each one wrapped with the care of someone who had believed they would be found someday, even when no one was looking for them. She thought about Solomon Graves sitting in his sink box in the bay in 1917, watching the sky go empty under his own gun, understanding something that the men around him were not yet ready to understand. She thought about the long patience of a man who had decided to set himself out on cold water as a false thing so that the real ones would have somewhere to land. She thought about Sterling Voss and his warm and certain face. She thought about Prescott and Blythe in the marble corridor of the courthouse, and the word Blythe had not been able to find in time, whatever it might have been. She thought about Cody standing in the doorway with the check in his hands, and Harlan with his palm flat on the page, and Petra looking at her own hands as if meeting them for the first time. She thought about Leonard. The men who had measured Leonard Alcott and found him wanting had made the oldest mistake there is. They had looked at a quiet man in a worn coat who fixed boat engines and found words difficult and spent $300 on a falling down shack at the edge of a marsh, and they had seen nothing because nothing was all they had brought with them to look for. They had never understood that the most valuable things a person can leave behind are almost never the things that show. They are sealed behind ordinary walls. They are written in plain hands in account books no one thinks to open. They are the promise you keep without knowing why for 17 years, because the person who asked you to keep it loved you in the only language they fully possessed and trusted you to understand it, eventually given time and a cold enough morning and no other options left. The men who measure worth in money will always tell you a thing is worth less than it is, right up until the moment they try to own it. Vivian looked at her duck on the dark water of the gut. It sat the way Solomon had written a decoy should sit, low and calm and patient on the surface, steady in the current, not performing stillness, but genuinely possessing it, the way a thing possesses a quality when it has been made correctly from the inside out, when the weight is right and the keel is set true, and there is nothing in its construction that works against the water it was made to rest on. From the shanty behind her, the sound of Cody's truck in the yard, the creak of the repaired door, the warm oblong of light that fell from the workshop window across the oyster shell and the marsh grass and out to the edge of the dock, where she was sitting, just reaching her feet where they hung over the dark water. She did not call out. She did not need to. In a few minutes she heard his boots on the planks of the dock and felt the boards settle slightly under his weight, and he came and sat down beside her without speaking and looked at the duck on the water. They sat there together for a while without saying anything, which was the kind of silence that is not absence but presence, the silence of two people who have been through something together and have arrived somewhere on the other side of it. Out on the bay beyond the gut, the real ducks were moving in the dark. She could hear them, the low murmur of a resting flock, the occasional soft calling of a bird locating itself among the others. They were there every evening now, had been since September. The birds that wintered on this water, as they had wintered on it, for as long as there had been marsh and bay and cold weather to drive them south. They did not know about Solomon Graves. They did not know about Leonard Alcott or the ledger in its archival box in a climate-controlled room in Easton, or the courtroom in the county seat where a judge had read the words known and unknown, discovered and undiscovered, and found them sufficient. They only knew the water and the cold and the sound of other birds nearby, the sound that told them this was a safe place, that something calm was here, that they could land. Vivian looked at her black duck riding the current in the dark, patient and steady and entirely at home on the worst water. She understood at last what she had become. Not wealthy though she was that now, in a modest and careful way. Not famous though the museum in Easton would tell her story to anyone who came to stand before the case that held the ledger. Not restored because she had not been broken, only compressed by circumstances into a smaller version of herself than she had been meant to be. What she had become was what Solomon had always been trying to make when he set his carved birds out on the cold water of the bay. Something that looked real enough and was calm enough and rode the water steadily enough that the lost ones would see it and know they could come down. The children would be back on Saturday. There was cedar to order and oatmeal to make and knives to sharpen and a new block already roughed out on the bench waiting for her hands in the morning. There were names not yet written in the ledger that would be written there in time and hands she had not yet met, by people who did not yet know that the shanty at Heron's Point was the place they were looking for. The dock was solid under her. The current moved the duck gently, and it did not tip. The light from the shanty reached all the way to where she was sitting, just touching her, where the dock ended and the dark water began. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. That means more than you know. There are 2 more stories waiting for you right there on your screen, and if this one found something real in you tonight, those will too. Just tap to keep watching. And before you go, subscribe and turn on the bell so the next quiet story finds its way to you.